The rope had been there long enough that the bark had grown around part of it. That was the first thing Elias Cutter noticed when he came up through the arroyo in the low morning light of October 1883, following a lame horse at a walk and cursing the loose shoe he hadn't fixed in Tucson when he'd had the chance. The cottonwood was old and broad, and the rope was cinched tight around the trunk and then tight around the woman's wrists behind her. And the bark had already begun to swallow the lower coil, the way trees swallow everything given enough time. She had been there since at least the night before, maybe longer. She wasn't unconscious, that was the second thing. Her eyes were open and tracking him the moment he came into view, and there was nothing in them that looked like relief. He stopped the horse 10 feet out and looked at her a long moment. She was young, not yet 30, he thought, dressed in the kind of worn cloth that was neither fully Apache nor fully white, but somewhere between the two, the way certain lives end up when they've moved through more than one world. Her face was drawn with thirst, but composed. Whatever she was expecting from him, it wasn't rescue. He could see that plainly. "You want down from there?" he said. She said nothing. Before starting the video, be sure to subscribe, like, and write in the comments where you are watching us from. He'd come up from the Mexican border 6 weeks prior, alone, which was the way he'd been traveling since he left everything he owned in the town of Mesilla, New Mexico, in the spring of 1882. He was 37 years old and moved like a man who'd taken enough that his body had simply stopped presenting the injuries as surprises and started filing them as inventory. His left hand didn't fully close. His right ear picked up sounds that weren't there sometimes, especially in the hours before dawn. He'd worked cattle, fences, freight, whatever kept him moving without requiring him to stay. He'd learned not to look at things too long, because looking led to thinking, and thinking led to the kind of accounting a man couldn't survive if he wanted to keep going. He looked at her too long anyway. He got down off the horse, took his knife from his belt, and cut the rope. She didn't fall. She stepped forward and turned and looked at the severed ends as if confirming something she'd already suspected. Then she looked at him with the same expression and said, in English that was better than his, and carried an accent he couldn't place precisely, "You don't know what you just did." "No," he agreed, "I generally don't." Her name was Lena, which was not the name she'd been given at birth, but the name the mission school in San Carlos had pressed onto her when she was 9 years old, and which she had kept because the original had become complicated in ways she didn't explain. She drank from his canteen for a long time without asking permission, and handed it back without thanks, which he found neither rude nor surprising, just direct, the way people are when they've been past the point of social performance and come back to something more fundamental. She had a cut above her left ear that had dried to a dark crust, and her wrists were raw where the rope had been. He had a piece of linen cloth in his saddlebag that had started its life as a shirt and was now used for everything else, and he tore a length of it and held it out. She took it and wrapped her own wrists without looking at him while she did it, which told him something about the nature of her self-sufficiency and something else about the nature of her pride. "How long?" he asked. "Since yesterday morning." He did the arithmetic and kept it to himself. Better part of a day and a half in October desert heat, tied upright against cottonwood bark. The fact that she was standing and speaking in coherent sentences said something that no amount of explaining could have communicated better. "Who put you there?" She didn't answer immediately. She was looking east, toward a rise of broken rock that caught the early light and held it in narrow orange seams. When she did speak, she spoke to the rocks rather than to him. "My uncle," she said, "and 3 men who listened to him." He waited. "There was a decision of the elders, about land, about who speaks for the band to the agency men." She paused. "I spoke against it. I spoke loudly. I had learned from the school how the papers worked, and the papers said what they were agreeing to was wrong. They were agreeing to give away water rights that would leave them with nothing by the following summer." She turned and looked at him then, directly, and he noticed her eyes were not black as he'd assumed in the shadows, but a very dark brown, with a quality of stillness that made him feel briefly like a man being assessed rather than helped. Women don't speak loudly at such meetings. That is the law. I knew that. I spoke anyway. He thought about that. He'd broken a few laws in his time. Not all of them felt like breaking. So they tied you up. They tied me where I would be found by whoever came through the arroyo, thirsty enough to be quiet for a while. It was meant as a lesson. She looked back at the severed rope, the pale inner fibers still showing their freshness. You've made the lesson impossible to complete. Seems like the lesson was already failing, he said. Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, more like the muscle memory of one, surfacing and then retreating without arriving fully. Yes, she said. It was. They stood in the thin shade of the cottonwood for a moment, and the horse shifted its weight on the bad shoe, and the desert beyond the arroyo was already bright with the coming heat. He thought about the road south, which was where he'd been going, toward the Dragoon Mountains, where someone owed him 3 weeks of back wages for fence work. He thought about the road north, which was where this woman would have to go if she was going anywhere at all, since east was the agency and west was nothing for 70 miles. Your people, the men who did this, he said. They'll come back to check. This evening, she said, when the sun is lower. He looked at the sky. It was not yet 7 in the morning. You can't go back, he said. It wasn't a question. Not until my uncle changes his mind, or dies. She said it the way a person says a fact, without drama. He is 61 years old, and his mind hasn't changed about anything in 20 years. Elias Cutter squinted at the horizon and thought about the 3 weeks of wages he was owed, and the lame horse, and the fact that he hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. He thought, briefly, about the kind of man he'd been before Messiah, and the kind he'd been after, and whether there was any version of himself left that would have simply ridden south without looking back. There wasn't. He'd checked before. I'm heading north, he said, which was a lie, and they both knew it, but which became true in the moment of saying it. Got room on the horse if you want to walk alongside. She looked at his horse with a professional eye. Your horse has a loose left forefoot shoe. I know. You'll need to stop and pull it before the nail drives in. Another 4 miles on that, and the horse goes lame for a week. I know, he said again. There's a farrier in Benson. I know where Benson is. She nodded. Then we go to Benson. He didn't answer. He gathered the horse's reins and started north, and she walked beside him, not behind, and the rope lay in the dust at the base of the cottonwood, with its ends still pale and clean where the blade had passed through. By the time they reached the edge of the arroyo and came out onto open ground, the sun was already pressing down with its full October weight, which, in that part of the Arizona Territory, meant something serious and not to be negotiated with. The land spread out ahead of them in the colors of old clay and dry grass, broken here and there by formations of rock that stood up from the flats like the ruins of something enormous that hadn't been finished. There was no shade for 3 miles in any direction, except what a man or woman made with their own body. She walked without difficulty. He watched her from the corner of his eye, not staring, just noting. And what he noticed was that she moved the way people move when they've spent considerable time outdoors and know exactly where their feet are at all times. Not the uncertain step of someone recovering from shock or dehydration. Something steadier than that. She had catalogued herself somewhere in the night and made whatever adjustments were necessary and arrived on the other side of it still intact. Psychologist Bessel van der Kolk wrote in his work The Body Keeps the Score that trauma is not stored as memory in the conventional sense. It lives in the body's posture, in the rhythm of breath, in the readiness of muscle. What he meant was that the body develops its own intelligence about survival, one that operates below thought, and that this intelligence is often the last thing to abandon a person, even when everything else has. Elias Cutter, who had never read a word of van der Kolk and wouldn't have recognized the name, nonetheless understood this principle the way a man understands gravity. Not through explanation, but through the repeated experience of things falling. He recognized it in her walk. He recognized it, dimly, as something he shared. They were perhaps 2 miles north when he heard the horses. Not on the road, off to the east, moving parallel and fast, the way riders move when they already know where they're going and are simply crossing open ground to get there. He stopped and shaded his eyes and counted. 4 riders. Coming from the direction of the rock formation where she'd been looking that morning. Coming fast. He looked at her. She had already stopped walking and was looking in the same direction, with an expression that carried no surprise whatsoever. Only a kind of quiet, contained recognition, the way a person looks when something they calculated has arrived on schedule. "Your uncle," he said. "My uncle," she said, "does not ride." She watched the riders a moment longer. "Those are the 3 men who listened to him." She paused. "And someone else." 4 riders. His horse, lame on the left forefoot, carrying double weight even for the 2 miles they'd covered. No trees, no draws, no shelter between here and the low hills still 2 miles north. He looked at her. She was looking at the riders without moving, and then she turned and looked at him with that still brown gaze and said something he didn't expect. "Do you know how to negotiate?" He said he knew how to try. She shook her head once, a small, precise movement, not impatient but correcting, the way a person adjusts a tool that's been held wrong. Negotiation is not trying. Negotiation is knowing what the other man needs more than he needs to win. She looked back at the riders, who were still perhaps a mile out but closing the distance without any sign of hesitation. "Do you know what they need?" He didn't. "They need me to go back quietly," she said. "They need no one to know that a white man cut the rope, because if that becomes a story, and everything becomes a story out here, then the elders lose the weight of their judgment. Everyone will know a stranger walked through and undid what they did in one motion and rode on." She let that sit for a moment. "That is more dangerous to my uncle than I am." Cutter looked at the riders again and then back at her. "So they want to stop us before we reach Benson." "Before we reach anyone," she said. He thought about that. The riders were 3/4 of a mile out now, and he could see the horses were good. Not agency horses, not the tired stock he'd seen corralled at San Carlos when he'd passed through in August. These were animals someone had paid attention to. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Better than you," she said, without particular pride, just as information. He handed her the reins. She took them and looked at the horse's feet with the same assessing expression she'd used on him that morning. And then she swung up with the ease of someone who has been getting on horses since before they could properly reach the stirrup, and she settled in the saddle and looked down at him. "Pull the shoe," she said. "Right now, before you do anything else." He stared at her. "The nail is already pressing. Another 1/4 mile at speed and you'll have a lame horse with a rider on it in open ground. And then you'll have nothing. Pull it now. It takes 40 seconds. I'll keep their attention." He had no idea how she intended to keep their attention, and no time to ask. He crouched down and took the loose shoe between his palms and worked it, feeling the give where the nail had already shifted. And he pulled it clean in something closer to 30 seconds, which was as fast as he'd ever done it. The horse shook its head and blew air, and immediately stood easier on that foot. When he straightened up, she had moved the horse forward 40 yards toward the approaching riders, and stopped, facing them, sitting very still in the saddle. He could not hear what was said at that distance, and the conversation, if it was a conversation, lasted less than a minute. Then she wheeled the horse and came back at a trot, and her face had not changed in any visible way. "Ride," she said. He put his boot in the stirrup, and she shifted back, and he came up and they rode north, at a pace that was just inside the horse's honest ability. Not panic, not a dead run, but serious. The kind of speed that says, "We are leaving, and this is not a question." He could hear the 4 riders coming now, not yet fast, not yet committed. Behind them, the desert opened up its full October silence between the hoofbeats. "What did you say to them?" he asked. I told them I was going to Benson to speak to the land agent about the water rights agreement, she said against the wind.
And that you were my witness. He let that land.
Are those things true? The first one, she said, just became true. They rode without speaking after that. The horse, freed of the dragging shoe, moved better than it had in days, and the four riders behind them neither gained nor fell fully away. They maintained a distance that was just beyond comfortable, a presence rather than a pursuit. The kind of following that says, "We are watching you, and you know we are watching you, and that is the point." Cutter had been followed by men before. He understood the grammar of it. This wasn't a chase. It was a message being delivered at speed across open ground. Benson was 9 miles north. They would make it by mid-morning if the horse held. The horse held.
The town announced itself the way small towns did in that country. First, a smear of smoke from cook fires, then the geometry of roof lines breaking the flat horizon, then the smell of animals and cut lumber and the particular dry dust that accumulates around places where wagons turn. It was not a large town. A main street of perhaps 12 buildings, a rail siding, a water tower still new enough that the wood hadn't fully grayed. The kind of place that existed because the railroad had decided to stop there and not for any other reason. They came in from the south at a walk, the horse breathing steady, and Cutter could feel the shift in the animal the moment they hit the first street. Horses know when they're in town. Something changes in their attention. He was aware of being looked at. A man and a woman on one horse, one of them Apache or close enough that no one would ask questions about the distinction, coming in from the direction of the desert with hard miles on their faces. People looked. That was normal. He kept his eyes forward and his hands easy on the reins. She slid down before he brought the horse fully to a stop in front of what the faded paint on the board above the door indicated was the Land Agency office, a narrow room between a dry goods store and a building that appeared to serve no particular purpose. She was on the ground and at the door before he'd finished tying the horse to the rail. He followed. The man inside was perhaps 50, with a clerk's stoop and the particular exhaustion of someone who processes paper in a hot room for 8 hours every day, and has been doing so long enough that the exhaustion has become structural. He looked up from his desk when they came in, and the look traveled from Cutter to Lena and back again with the practiced non-expression of a man who has learned to give nothing away in his face because his face is the first thing people negotiate against. "Help you?" he said. Lena set her hands flat on the edge of his desk and said, "I need to see the document filed by the Dos Arroyos band elders regarding the spring water access on the eastern reservation boundary, filed in the last 30 days. The clerk looked at her hands on his desk, then at her face, then at Cutter. Cutter said nothing and leaned against the doorframe. "That'd be a federal record," the clerk said. "Yes," she said. "I know what it is." There was a pause of the kind that exists not because anyone is thinking, but because a position is being established. Historian Patricia Limerick, in her work The Legacy of Conquest, documented in detail how much of the business of the American West was conducted in precisely these pauses. Not at gunpoint, not in open confrontation, but in the gap between what a bureaucrat had the technical authority to deny and what he understood he could actually justify denying if a record was made of his refusal. The power wasn't in the guns, Limerick argued. It was in the paper and in who knew how to read it. Lena knew how to read it. The clerk got up after a moment and went to a cabinet and came back with a folder and set it on the desk between them. She read it standing, and she read fast, not skimming but processing, her eyes moving in a pattern that suggested she knew exactly what she was looking for and where in a document of this kind it would appear. Cutter watched her face and saw nothing change on the surface of it, but he noticed her left hand, which was resting on the desk edge, press down slightly harder for a moment and then release. She'd found what she expected. "Can I have paper and something to write with?" she said. The clerk, who had by this point apparently decided that resistance was more trouble than compliance, produced both. She wrote for perhaps 4 minutes, copying sections from the document in a clear, deliberate hand, and then she folded the pages she'd written and put them inside her shirt. "Thank you," she said, which may have been the most purely functional thank you Cutter had ever heard. No warmth in it, no performance, just an acknowledgement that the transaction was complete. They went back outside into the October heat. The four riders were at the far end of the main street, sitting their horses, not approaching, watching. Cutter studied them for a moment. One of the horses was gray, and its rider sat differently from the others, straighter, older, with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that he does not need to demonstrate authority because everyone who matters already understands it. That one was not young. That one had been at this a long time. "The fourth man," he said quietly. "My uncle," she said, equally quiet. "He rides, after all." He absorbed this. She had either been wrong that morning or had chosen not to tell him. He decided it didn't matter which. "What did you copy from the document?" "The clause that voids the agreement if the signatory elders can be shown to have misrepresented the consent of the women of the band," she said. 1881 Indian Affairs Reform Provisions. The agent who wrote this agreement was careful. He included it because he was required to. My uncle and the men who negotiated with him did not read that far. Cutter turned this over. "You knew it was in there." "I knew the form," she said. "I studied every form the agency uses. For 2 years." She was still watching the four riders at the end of the street. "My uncle knew I had studied them. That is why he was afraid of me speaking at the meeting. That is why the rope." The math was becoming clearer. Not comfortable, but clear. "So you can challenge the agreement," he said. "If I can get the signatures of 3 senior women of the band who will attest they were not consulted." She paused. "That will take time, and my uncle will not make it easy." "Where are these women?" She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, considering. There was a difference, and he was beginning to be able to tell it. "2 of them are at the agency in San Carlos. One is here." He looked at her. "In Benson. Her daughter married a man who runs freight out of here. She's been living with them for 8 months." She finally turned from the riders and looked at him directly. "I didn't know I was going to be cut down from that tree today. But I knew if I ever got to Benson, there was a path forward from here." He stood with that for a moment. The sun was fully up now, striking the dust of the main street at an angle that made everything look slightly overexposed, the colors washed out to their blunt essentials. Around them, the town went about its business with the careful inattention of people who have learned that watching strangers too openly costs something eventually. Down the street, the four riders hadn't moved. He said, "What's her name? The woman here." "Dolly," she said. Then, registering something in his expression, "It means bluebird." He nodded once, filing it. "And your uncle, does he know she's here?" Something shifted in her face. Not alarm, more like the recalibration a person makes when a question lands closer to the center than expected. "He knows," she said. "He won't approach her directly. She is older than him, and she was the one who taught him to track when he was a boy." She stopped. "Some authorities cannot be undone by other authorities. They simply exist." Cutter looked at the riders one more time. The old man on the gray horse had not moved. "We need to find Dolly before your uncle decides that patience has its limits," he said. "Yes," she said. And then, after a beat, "There is also the matter of where you sleep tonight." He looked at her. "You cut the rope of a woman condemned by the elders of a band?" she said, with a flatness that was not unkind. "You've ridden into their territory with her and helped her reach a land office. They know your face now." She nodded toward the end of the street. "You can't go south anymore." He thought about the 3 weeks of wages he was owed in the Dragoon Mountains. He thought about a lot of things, briefly, and let most of them go the way you let go of something you've been carrying that has become too heavy, not because you want to, but because your hands have finally given out.
One problem at a time, he said. She almost smiled again. This time it made it a little further before retreating.
They started down the street, toward the side of town where the freight wagons were kept, walking side by side, and behind them, the four riders sat their horses and watched, and the October dust settled back into stillness in their wake, and the old man on the gray horse finally moved, not forward, not away, but sideways, turning the horse so he was no longer facing the direction they had gone, as if that direction had ceased to exist for him, or as if he was thinking about something else entirely. Which was, Cutter would later understand, the most dangerous thing he could have done. They found the freight yard on the north edge of town, where 3 wagons stood in various states of being loaded or unloaded, and a man with a red beard was arguing with someone about the weight distribution of a load of copper pipe. The argument stopped when they came through the gate. Not because of Cutter, because of her. The red-bearded man looked at Lena with the particular expression of someone who recognizes a category before they recognize a person, and the category was doing most of the work in his face. She didn't look at him. She looked at the house behind the yard, a low adobe with a blanket hung across the doorway in place of a door, faded red and brown in a pattern that was not random. She walked toward it, and Cutter stayed at the gate, and the red-bearded man looked at Cutter with the question he hadn't put into words yet. "She's looking for someone," Cutter said. "Who?" "That's her business." The man looked back at the house and then at Cutter again, and whatever he found in Cutter's face apparently settled the question for him, because he went back to his argument about copper pipe. The blanket moved, and Lena went inside. Cutter stood at the gate and watched the street behind them. The 4 riders had not followed into town, or, if they had, they'd found somewhere less visible to wait, which was worse. He could feel the morning pressing down with its accumulated weight. The cut rope, the miles on a bad shoe, the land office, the copied document, and now this freight yard with its smell of axle grease and hay, and the specific exhaustion of animals that work every day. He was thirsty again, and his back ached in the particular place it always ached when he'd ridden double for any distance, a spot just left of his spine that had been introduced to a fence post in a way he preferred not to revisit. He watered the horse at the trough by the gate and pulled a piece of dried meat from his saddlebag and ate it without tasting it, and watched the street. The blanket moved again, and Lena came out, followed by a woman who was perhaps 70 years old, small and upright, with white hair pulled back simply, and hands that looked like they had shaped more things than Cutter could readily imagine. Hands that carried the particular authority of long use, the way old tools carry it. She wore a plain cotton dress, and she moved without hurry, which was its own kind of speed. She looked at Cutter with eyes that were very clear and very direct, and held him there for a moment the way a person holds a door open, just long enough to make a judgment. Then she spoke to Lena in Apache, briefly. Lena translated without being asked. "She wants to know if you can be trusted." He thought about several answers and discarded all of them. "Tell her I don't know," he said. "Tell her I cut a rope this morning without knowing what it meant, and I'm still not sure what it means. Tell her that's all I've got." Lena translated. The old woman listened, and then said something short. She says, "That's the most honest thing a white man has said to her in 40 years, Lena said. There was no humor in the delivery, but there was something there, a slight warming, like a stone that's been in the sun long enough to give back a little of what it's taken. The old woman, dully, gestured toward the house and went back inside. Lena looked at Cutter. "She'll sign," she said. "She says the water agreement is foolish, and she told them so before the meeting, and no one wrote that down." "That helps?" "It means her testimony is consistent. It means she objected in advance, which matters to the agency's review process." She paused. "It means my uncle knew her position and proceeded anyway, which is the part that will be difficult for him to explain." Cutter nodded. He was putting it together in pieces, the way you navigate country you don't know. Not with a map, because there isn't one, but by reading what's in front of you and committing to the next 50 yards at a time. "You need the 2 women at San Carlos." "Yes." "How far?" 40 miles. He looked at the horse. The horse had done good work today and would do more if asked, but 40 miles was a conversation they'd need to have honestly. When does the agency's review period close on this kind of agreement? She looked at him with something new in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, the way a person recalibrates when something fits a slot they'd already measured without saying so. How do you know there's a review period? Saw one of these disputes in New Mexico 2 years back, he said. Land grant, not water rights, but similar paper. Had a 60-day review window. 45 days for water access agreements, she said. The document was filed 22 days ago. 23 days left. He did the rest of the arithmetic silently. 40 miles to San Carlos, the time it would take to find the women and get their signatures witnessed by someone with standing, the ride back, the filing, and all of it through territory where 4 riders knew their direction, and an old man on a gray horse was thinking about something other than the road they were on, which meant he was thinking about where they were going to end up. We need a witness for Dolly's signature, he said. Someone the agency will accept. The land agent here. He thought about the clerk with the stoop and the careful non-expression. He'll do it? He'll do it if I explain to him that failure to witness a valid submission in a federal review process carries penalties under the 1875 Indian Appropriations Act. She said it the way someone says the name of a tool they've used before, with a quiet, practiced familiarity. He doesn't need to want to. He just needs to understand that refusing has consequences he can't easily explain to anyone who asks. Cutter looked at her for a moment. In her work, A Different Mirror, historian Ronald Takaki documented how the knowledge of white legal systems became, for many Native people in the post-Civil War West, the only form of armor that could not be confiscated. How certain individuals, educated in mission schools that intended to erase their identity, took the tools of that erasure and turned them into something else entirely, something the schools had not planned for, and the legal system was poorly equipped to counter. What Takaki described in the aggregate, Cutter was watching in one particular woman on a Tuesday morning in October outside a freight yard in Benson, Arizona. He went back to the land office. The clerk signed as witness to Dolly's statements in a handwriting that got slightly less steady as the implications settled on him, and Lena guided him through the correct forms with the patience of a schoolteacher who has explained something many times and has long since ceased to be frustrated by the need to explain it again. When it was done, she folded the papers and put them with the others inside her shirt, and thanked the clerk in the same functional way as before. Outside, Cutter had bought bread and dried beans from the general store and filled both canteens. It wasn't much, but it was a start toward 40 miles. They were back at the horse when the shadow came across the ground from his left, and he turned and found one of the 4 riders standing perhaps 15 feet away, having come out of the space between 2 buildings without sound. Not the old man. Younger, perhaps 25, with the flat watchfulness of someone doing a job rather than acting from feeling. He had his thumbs in his belt and was not reaching for anything, but his presence was a statement made in the clearest possible language. Lena did not turn. She continued adjusting the saddlebag. He's saying we're being watched, she said, not to Cutter, not to the young man, to the space between them, and no one in particular. Yes, Cutter said. He won't do anything here. Town is too many witnesses. I know. The young rider looked at Cutter with eyes that were neither hostile nor friendly, but precisely attentive, the way a man looks when he is making sure he will remember a face accurately. Then he turned and walked back into the space between the buildings and was gone. They rode out of Benson heading northwest, which was not the direct route to San Carlos, but was a route that crossed 3 other roads and gave them options. And the land was wide and empty in a way that felt less like freedom than like exposure. That particular vulnerability of open country where everything that moves can be seen from a long way off, including the people trying not to be seen. She rode behind him, and they didn't speak for the first several miles, which was comfortable in a way that surprised him when he noticed it. Silence was usually something that gathered tension between people who didn't know each other. This silence had a different quality, more like the silence between people doing the same work in the same room, where there's nothing that needs saying because the task itself is the conversation. Around the fourth mile, she said, "You had a horse before this one." He didn't ask how she knew. "Yes." "Better horse?" "Different horse." She waited. "Mare," he said. "Chestnut. Worked cattle with her for 4 years." He looked at the road. "She went down in the spring. Broke her leg on a gully I should have gone around and set her through." He paused. "It was getting dark. I was in a hurry." He paused again. "I wasn't in a hurry. I just told myself I was." The desert moved past them in the slow way it does when you're in it rather than looking at it. Not the grand panorama of distance, but the close particular world of individual rocks and dry grasses and the occasional flash of something alive moving low to the ground before disappearing. She said, "I had a brother. He was good at things I was not good at." She stopped there, and he understood from the tense and the complete stillness that followed that he was not present tense. "He died in 1881. Sickness, not violence. Though by then the distinction was not always clear." He nodded, looking at the road. "I speak loudly at meetings," she said, "partly because he would have. He was not afraid of what people thought. I am afraid of it. I just decided the fear was not the part that got to choose." Bessel van der Kolk, again, in The Body Keeps the Score, writing about the specific mechanism by which people who have survived loss learn to act in spite of fear rather than in the absence of it. A distinction that is not semantic but neurological. A rewiring that happens slowly and without announcement and costs something that cannot be measured from the outside. What it looks like from the outside is courage. What it feels like from the inside is closer to stubbornness. He understood this in the way he understood most things that mattered, not through words, but through recognition. "The mare's name was Clara," he said. She didn't say anything. But her hand, which was resting lightly on his hip for balance on the road's uneven surface, pressed down slightly for a moment. 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then returned to its previous lightness. That was all. The sun had moved into the southwest by the time the hills above San Carlos came into view, and the temperature had dropped enough to change the quality of the light from white to gold, and the desert had shifted from hostile to merely indifferent, which was as close to welcoming as it generally got. Cutter's back had moved past the aching stage into a kind of numb acceptance, and the horse was still honest, but breathing the truth about the miles. They came into the agency approach at an angle that kept the main buildings in view from a distance, and what was in view was not immediately reassuring. There were more horses at the rail than the hour warranted, 6, 7, and their tack was not agency stock, not the worn equipment of people who worked there every day. These were visitors who had arrived recently, and with purpose. Lena saw it at the same moment he did. "How far ahead of us can your uncle travel?" he asked. "He knows shorter routes," she said, quietly. "I was afraid of this." "He's inside?" "Or his words are inside," she said, "which is the same thing." They sat the horse at the approach and looked at the buildings and the horses and the particular way the afternoon light was hitting the dust around the agency door, which was the kind of stillness that happens not when nothing is occurring, but when whatever is occurring is happening indoors. "If we go in, we're walking into whatever he's set up," Cutter said. "Yes." "If we don't go in, we lose the 23 days." "Yes." He thought for a moment. "The two women, they know you're coming?" "No." "Do they know your uncle?" "Everyone in the band knows my uncle." He nodded slowly. "Do they like him?" Something moved across her face. Not quite the almost smile from this morning. Something older and more complicated than that. "My uncle," she said carefully, "is a man who has never been wrong in his own accounting. Not once. 40 years without an error, by his own ledger." She paused.
Women who have lived long enough have opinions about men like that. Cutter looked at the agency buildings one more time. "Is there a back way in?" he said. "Through the supply yard," she said. "Past the smith." He turned the horse off the road. The supply yard smelled of coal smoke and manure, and the sharp mineral scent of water on hot stone from somewhere nearby where a pipe was leaking. They left the horse tied behind the smith's shed, out of sight of the main approach, and went the rest of the way on foot through a corridor of stacked lumber and empty barrels that had once held salt pork and were now serving as evidence of an agency that ordered more than it distributed. The smith himself was still at his forge, working late, and he looked up when they passed and said nothing, which was a kind of permission. Some men know when to be busy with their own business. This one had learned it the way most people learn the useful things, through the cost of not knowing it earlier. Lena moved through the back of the agency complex with the confidence of someone who has memorized a floor plan, not by walking it once, but by thinking about it many times in advance. She knew which door opened inward and which stuck, and she knew that the third window on the north side of the residential block had a broken latch that had been broken for at least 6 months, because nothing at the San Carlos agency was repaired in under 6 months, unless it was something the agent needed personally. She pushed the window, and it opened, and she went through it with a motion that was both quick and quiet, and Cutter followed with considerably less grace but adequate silence. Inside was a narrow hallway that smelled of lye soap and old wool. Doors on both sides, all closed. She moved to the second door on the left and knocked twice, then once, then twice again. A pause of perhaps 10 seconds. Then the door opened. The woman inside was perhaps 65, with a face that had the quality of land that has been through every kind of weather and come out the other side not broken, but compressed. Everything unnecessary, worn away. She looked at Lena for a long moment, and then at Cutter, and then back at Lena. And she said something in Apache that was short and that contained, even to Cutter's ear, a note of something between exasperation and relief. Lena said, "She says she has been waiting for 2 days for me to do something stupid enough to require this kind of entrance." "Did she know you were coming?" "She knew something was coming." Lena stepped inside. "Her name is Nata. She was my mother's closest friend." Nata looked at Cutter again with the evaluating stillness of someone who has outlived several categories of men and is simply determining which one he belongs to. Then she moved to the small table in the corner of the room and sat down and folded her hands on the table and waited, which was its own form of statement. She was willing to hear, but she was not willing to come to them. They would come to her. They did. Lena spread the copied documents on the table and explained in Apache, occasionally pausing to render a phrase into English that Cutter could follow, though he was beginning to understand that the English translations were approximate, that there were things happening in the Apache that didn't fully cross over, not because they were untranslatable, but because the architecture of the two languages was different in ways that mattered, the way two buildings can serve the same function while being built on entirely different principles. Linguist Edward Sapir, in his early work on Native American language structures, documented precisely this phenomenon, that the grammatical categories of a language do not merely describe the world, but organize the speaker's perception of it, so that shifting between languages is not simply a matter of finding equivalent words, but of temporarily inhabiting a different logic. What Lena was doing, Cutter thought, watching her hands move over the papers and her voice shift registers, was not translation. It was something closer to negotiation between two ways of seeing the same situation. Nata listened without interrupting. When Lena finished, the old woman sat with the papers before her for a moment, not reading them exactly. Her relationship to written documents was clearly one of suspicion rather than familiarity, but acknowledging their presence, their weight in the situation. Then she said something. Lena was quiet for a moment before translating. "She says my uncle came through the agency this morning. He spoke to the supervising agent. He told him that I had been taken by a white man against my will and was being used to disrupt the band's legal agreements with the federal government." She paused. He told them you were a criminal with warrants in New Mexico. Cutter kept his face still. Lena glanced at him. Are there warrants in New Mexico? There was a dispute about cattle ownership in Lincoln County in 1882, he said. It was resolved. Resolved how? The man who claimed the cattle died of something unrelated. Lena looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then she turned back to the papers. The ceiling above them carried the sounds of the building. Boots on floorboards somewhere overhead, a door, a voice that was not distinguishable into words. The administrative portion of the agency was directly above. The supervising agent's office was up there. Possibly, at this moment, men sent by her uncle were up there describing Elias Cutter in terms that would not help him. How much time do we have? He said. Lena asked. Nata answered. She says the agent sent a writer to Benson an hour ago, for the sheriff. Lena kept her voice level. She heard it from the woman who brings the evening meal. The writer left at 4:30. Cutter looked at the window. The light outside had gone from gold to the deep amber that preceded dark. 4:30 to now. Perhaps 90 minutes. A writer to Benson was a 2-hour trip at an easy pace. Call it 90 minutes hard. If the sheriff moved immediately, which was unlikely, they had perhaps 3 to 4 hours. If the sheriff waited until morning, which was more likely, they had until dawn. The mathematics of it were not comfortable, but they were clear. Nata will sign, Lena said. She says she will sign because the water agreement is wrong, and because my uncle has been wrong about this for 2 years, and she has been telling him so, and he has been not listening for exactly that long, and she is tired of being a voice that is heard but not received. She paused. She also says that if you are a criminal in New Mexico, she has known worse men who called themselves agents of the government, so she does not hold it against you. Cutter looked at Nata. Nata looked back at him with the particular expression of someone who has said a generous thing and is not going to repeat it. Thank you, he said. She nodded once, which closed the subject. They needed a witness. A federal witness, someone with standing in the agency's own system, because a signature without proper attestation was a document that could be challenged, and would be. He knew without asking that they couldn't go upstairs to the supervising agent. They needed someone inside this building who had official standing and was not already in the uncle's pocket, and could be convinced that witnessing this signature was either the right thing or the safe thing, or preferably both. He asked Lena. She thought for a moment. Then she said, There's a clerk named Harold Marsh. He processes the ration distribution records. He's been here 4 years, and he has never done anything that I know of that was either notably good or notably bad. He follows the rules because the rules are what he understands. She paused. He knows me. I helped him correct a calculation error in the distribution ledger 8 months ago. He would have been dismissed if the error had been found by the audit. He knows I didn't report it. Cutter considered this. Does he know he owes you? He knows, she said. He has never said so, but he knows. There are debts that are never spoken and never forgiven, because they exist in a space below the level of language, in the quiet arithmetic that people keep about each other without ever writing it down. Psychologist John Bowlby, in his foundational work on attachment, described the human need for felt security, the sense that there exists at least one other person who can be counted on when counting matters. What Bowlby meant at the level of early development translates, in adult life, into the precise phenomenon Lena was describing. Harold Marsh had been given, once, the experience of being held when he was falling. He did not know her name for it, but his body knew. She left the room and came back in 6 minutes with a thin man of perhaps 40 who had the look of someone who had been fetched unexpectedly and was trying to decide whether to be alarmed. He looked at the room, at Cutter standing against the wall, at Nata at the table, at Lena holding the documents. And some internal calculation ran visibly across his face, brief and private, and then settled. He said, "This is for the review period."
Yes, Lena said. If the agent finds out I witnessed this without his approval, the agent's approval is not required for the witnessing of a valid submission document, she said. His approval is required for the submission itself, which goes through the federal office in Tucson, not through him. She held his gaze. You're not doing anything he can discipline you for. You're performing a clerical function within your authorized duties. Harold Marsh looked at the documents. He looked at Nata, who looked back at him with the serenity of someone who has entirely finished caring what the outcome will be for anyone but the people whose water she was trying to protect.
He looked at Cutter, who gave him nothing. No reassurance, no pressure, just the neutral presence of a man who understood that this was not his moment to speak. Marsh took out a pen. The signing took 4 minutes, including the time Lena spent ensuring every line was filled correctly, every date written in the proper form, every designation accurate. She was meticulous in a way that was clearly not perfectionism but self-defense. She knew that the document's enemies would look for the smallest technical error and use it, so she gave them none. When it was done, she blotted the signatures and folded the pages with care and put them with the others. Marsh left without ceremony, which was its own kind of courage. The courage of someone who does the right thing and walks back into their ordinary life and says nothing about it, which is harder than it sounds. Nata spoke. She wants to know if you're hungry, Lena said. He was. They both were. She fed them from what she had in her room. Cold fry bread and dried meat, and something that had once been coffee and was now a suggestion of coffee. And they ate at the small table while she sat in the single chair and watched them with an expression he couldn't fully read, though it carried in it something that wasn't pity and wasn't approval, but was somewhere in the vicinity of recognition. After a while, she spoke again, more than she'd said at once before. Lena listened, and when she finished, Lena was quiet for a moment before she translated. She says she knew my mother before the Troubles. She says my mother spoke loudly at meetings, too. She says the family has a history of speaking at the wrong time, which is another way of saying the right time. Lena's voice was even, but something had changed in it the way light changes when a cloud moves. Not darker, just different. She says my uncle was not always the man he is now. She says he became this man slowly, over many years, after the things that happened, and that it is possible to understand how a person becomes something without approving of what they have become. She paused. She says she does not think my uncle is a bad man. She says he is a man who is afraid, and that afraid men do the things he has done. Cutter ate the last of the fry bread and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That doesn't make the rope any shorter." Lena translated. Nata listened and then made a sound that was unambiguously a laugh, short, dry, real, and said something brief. She says no, Lena said. It doesn't. They left through the window the way they'd come in, back through the corridor of empty barrels and the smell of coal smoke, and the smith's forge was dark now, the fire banked for the night, and the horse was where they'd left it, patient and uncomplaining in the way horses are when they've had water and simply have to wait. The night was cold, with the abrupt cold of desert October, the temperature dropping 15 degrees from the last hour of daylight to the first hour of dark. And the stars were so many and so close, it was almost unpleasant, an excess of clarity that felt slightly threatening, as if the sky was pressing down instead of opening up. He untied the horse and looked north and south and east along the edge of the agency approach and saw nothing moving. "The third woman," he said quietly. "Where?" "She's in the main residential block," Lena said, "on the other side of the building from where we came out." "Your uncle's men will be watching the main approach." "Yes." "Is there another way in?" She looked at the layout of the buildings, visible in silhouette against the overlit sky. She looked for a long time without speaking, and he let her look, understanding that she was not hesitating but calculating, which are two entirely different activities that look the same from the outside. "There is one way," she said finally, "but it goes past the room where the agent holds evening meetings." She paused. "My uncle may be in that meeting." He waited. If he sees me, she said, he won't make a scene. Not in front of the agent. He is too careful for that. She paused again. But he'll move faster after. Whatever he's been planning, it accelerates. Cutter thought about this. He thought about the sheriff's rider going to Benson, and the morning, and the documents in her shirt, and the third woman on the other side of the building. He thought about a man who had been afraid for so many years that the fear had restructured him entirely. Like water finding the path of least resistance until the path and the water are indistinguishable from each other. "What's your uncle's name?" he said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I'm going to speak to him," he said. "And I'd rather not say, your uncle." A long pause. The stars pressed down. "Chato," she said. "And then?" "It means flat nose. The Spanish gave it to him." Her voice carried something careful in it. "He has another name, his real name. But I won't give that to you. That's his to give." "Chato," Cutter said. "What are you going to say to him?" He thought about it. He thought about the 3 weeks of wages in the Dragoon Mountains that he would now never collect. He thought about Clara, the mare, and the gully he should have gone around. He thought about the kind of man who builds a case against the world, brick by brick, over 40 years, until the case is solid enough to imprison him inside it. "I'm going to tell him the math changed," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those still brown eyes. "He won't listen," she said. "He doesn't need to listen," Cutter said. "He just needs to understand." He handed her the horse's reins. "Get to the third woman," he said. "Get the signature. Get back to this horse in 30 minutes." He looked at the silhouette of the building. "I'll be at the front." She held the reins and looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read in the dark, though it had in it something he recognized, the specific quality of a person recalibrating their understanding of someone they thought they had already accurately measured. "Elias," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name. He stopped. "Don't tell him I'm here," she said. "Tell him I went south. Tell him I went toward the border." "Why?" "Because he'll believe it," she said. "It's what he would do. He always assumes others move the way he would move." A pause. "And because if he thinks I've run, he'll pause. He'll reassess." A man like that needs to feel he's won something before he can think clearly. She paused one more time. "Give me the 30 minutes." He looked at her. 30 minutes, he said. He walked around the front of the building, and the night opened up before him, wide and cold and full of stars. And somewhere in the darkness behind the agency, 4 horses were waiting. And one of them was gray.